My name's Aleatha Shanley and I work at Edith Cowan University as a lecturer there in information security. And my current research at the moment is in Australian attitudes towards privacy of information and whether or not COVID will make a difference. So I'm really honoured to be here at this conference. This is the first time for me, so hopefully I can do this rather smoothly. And on behalf of my colleagues, Michael Johnstone, Michael Crowley and Patryk Szewczyk, who also helped co-write this paper. So I don't think that it's anything new that there's always been tension between security needs and the citizens of a nation state in terms of privacy and security. And I think it's pretty well known for those of us that are in this, that are kind of investigating this landscape, that terrorist and crime-related incidents tend to shift the balance more towards security, whilst the proponents of civil liberties tend to move it more towards the other direction, in other words, privacy. So with COVID-19, obviously this has emerged and it has presented a lot of privacy concerns for the public, privacy advocates, and I would also like to add that security proponents as well are probably struggling with this to some degree, whereby they're trying to introduce new surveillance technologies to respond to the pandemic, but yet they're being kind of, they're having issues with the privacy side of things to get the technologies up and running, so to speak. So how do we strike that balance? And that's what this paper is primarily about. And towards the end of the session, I'll talk about where this research is heading. But perhaps trying to get that balance is something of a struggle on both sides of the fence. So hopefully I can shed some light on that. So the major terrorist attacks, such as September 11, among others, have definitely contributed to accelerated use of surveillance. And the advancements in these types of technologies and surveillance programs, coupled with public concern, have seen a significant rise in the development and use of these technologies. So otherwise known as privacy intrusive technologies. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that term, but we'll have a look at what those are shortly. The law is certainly struggling to keep up with these surveillance programs in terms of how to deal with privacy issues, information capture, the collection of this type of information, the storage and use of it, and future uses of the information that is collected. So how will COVID-19 impact this debate? I think it's going to have a significant impact personally, but time will certainly tell. And will the response to the pandemic impact attitudes towards privacy as well? So in other words, as we're introducing more surveillance technologies because of this pandemic and perhaps future pandemics, will that impact the public's attitudes towards the response effort? So I think these are all interesting questions. We do have a few areas of concern. So the introduction of these systems and the laws that support their use appear to be contradictory, and we'll have a bit of a look at those throughout this session. Judicial matters bring forth some problems, especially here in Australia, because we have 7 different states and territories, and they all have their own jurisdiction, their own laws, and so therefore it becomes very complicated when we're dealing with privacy laws. And to make matters more confusing, we have international laws as well that are being introduced into the mix, such as the Cloud Act, and Australia is currently in a bilateral agreement with the United States on that, although it hasn't yet been finalised. But then we come to looking at things such as who's responsible for the data storage and what happens if there's a breach, etc. So the public citizens are pretty much lost in this kind of mess, if you like, where they're struggling to keep up with the technological advancements and also the laws that supposedly protect their privacy. So we look at it in this paper through Turner's theory of power. Now, Turner's theory of power basically looks at group formation or the development of shared social identity as the catalyst, and it looks at these three different elements of influence, so being persuasion, authority, and coercion, and we'll have a bit more of a look at that later on. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term privacy intrusive technologies, which I'm sure most of you are, otherwise referred to as surveillance or observational technologies, but the literature does refer to them as PITs in some cases, and these are primarily things such as closed circuit TV, body scanners, drones, etc. But I think it's important to note that the technology itself isn't considered in its own right. It's more the intended use of the technology. So in other words, these types of technologies can lend themselves to function creep. So what they were intended to be used for originally doesn't necessarily mean that that's all they'll be used for. And of course, depending on the government of the day and emerging problems such as COVID, we see things shifting in this space. So we know that privacy is recognised in fundamental documents. These can be found in Universal Declaration for Human Rights, apologies there, among other documents. But the point being that historically, Australians have been reluctant to accept government attempts to impose, universal identification type technologies or systems. I've put a few examples here, such as the National Identity Card, which was in the 80s, and that failed dismally. The 2016 census data, now this isn't the first attempt at trying to retain that data and use it for other purposes, but it has since failed. And more recently, the My Health Record, just to cite a few examples there. But we can certainly get from the literature that Australian citizens, at least, certainly value privacy. So I've listed a couple of surveys here. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner in 2017 identified that 93% of respondents don't want their personal data sent or stored overseas. And similarly, the research from Goggin and colleagues revealed that Australians are generally concerned about their online privacy, which agrees with the OAIC study in 2017. So we know that we value privacy based on historical evidence and the literature, but more recently the Morrison government, which is Australia's current Prime Minister, Morrison, has introduced the CoGood Safe mobile application, and this has attracted greater acceptance with citizens. So even though it's had some technical issues and they've released draft legislation, which in the paper at that time was a draft, has now been enacted to protect privacy, we find that the Australian public really didn't reject the CoGood Safe app. There were, of course, some that did, so certainly privacy advocates had a look at this. But for the most part, the public accepted it. And when we look historically, the Australian public don't really like to accept intrusive types of surveillance. However, in this case, there was certainly not a lot of resistance to it. Now, we do have privacy laws in Australia, the Privacy Act being one of those. And we also have state and federal legislation, but again, jurisdictional issues come up there in terms of, compliance and who needs to adhere to those laws. However, the widespread, the need for privacy pre-COVID led to an increase in the use of encryption technology, which then led to other laws being brought forth. So in other words, we've got the Assistance and Access Act, the Identity Matching Services Bill, and proposed amendments to the Australian Security and Intelligence Act, and more recently the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment, which is all about data sharing overseas with the Cloud Act in the United States. So when we're talking about COVID-19 application data, that data is going to be stored on Amazon Web Services, and of course there's controversy over that in terms of what law trumps what. And the Cloud Act is now being introduced into the mix because Amazon Web Services is obviously an American company, and then we're talking about then who has jurisdiction, in terms of the data, if there's a breach, and who has access to that data. So the landscape becomes very complicated. So as I've said previously, an outcome is that the regulators are struggling to keep abreast of this, and we are currently undergoing a review in terms of the previous bill that I mentioned here, the International Production Orders Bill, in response to agreements with the Cloud Act in the United States. So the regulators are certainly struggling to keep up with this and their impact on society. Now, we also know that public trust, based on the literature, is a domain of concern. It plays a critical role regarding surveillance societies. So there's a few rather large surveys that you're probably familiar with in the EU, for example, the PAC survey and the PRISMS project. These relatively large studies found a strong correlation between public trust and privacy intrusive measures. So therefore, public trust played a critical role in the acceptance of security practices. So there seems to be, in my opinion, a discourse here. So we advocate privacy on one hand, while simultaneously implementing legislation that supports intrusive means of data collection on the other. So I've listed here a couple of examples in terms of privacy supporting legislation and security supporting legislation. So we've got the Australian Privacy Act, which, ensures that people adhere to privacy regulation and breaches of privacy, etc. There's also state privacy legislation, but not all. So Western Australia, where I currently reside, we don't have privacy legislation here, although there is moves to push that forward now, especially because of the GDPR that has been put forth in the EU. Basically because we were finding that companies didn't want to do business with other than this state if we didn't have privacy legislation. So that has kind of forced the hand of the state government here to kind of look at that. So I do believe that that is now on the table. Excuse me. So we also have the privacy amendment. Now this is related to the COVID-19 app. This was enacted very recently. It was, at the writing of the paper, a bill and has since been pushed through the Parliament, and that is in support of privacy of that application data that comes from that app. So security supporting legislation, which has been kind of controversial to the public and privacy advocates, is the Assistance and Amendment Act. Now this is basically assisting the federal government in decrypting information, so they can actually send out requests to suppliers of certain technologies to help them decrypt the information, or in some cases place backdoors in there so that they can actually decrypt the information. We have the Identity Matching Services Bill, which has not yet passed, at least the last time I checked, which was last week. That is more about having state and federal governments being able to upload facial images, license plate recognition, and a few other pieces of data such as passports, information to a centralised location for identity matching. And we are finding that that is currently happening. So, for example, in the state of Western Australia, post-COVID, or in the middle of the pandemic, they decided, well, not that they decided, perhaps it was pre-planned, that they were uploading that information to the national database. We also have the proposed amendments to the ASIO Act, as I already mentioned. Now, the ASIO Act, if you can just bear with me for a moment. The amendments here include provisions for them to use non-intrusive surveillance devices on Australian citizens without needing to apply for a court warrant, whereas previously they had to get a court order to do that. And the amendments here are wanting to bypass that. Then, of course, we have the International Production Orders Bill, which is about international cooperation and sharing of data across borders. So what do we really know about attitudes already? The literature suggests that both the terms privacy and security are used really loosely. And I'd have to agree, after a lot of reading, I certainly wouldn't try and define privacy and security in this session, but suffice to say that these terms can be used rather loosely, and various studies have shown that the framing of these questions and the context of privacy issues plays a role in attitudes and perceptions towards privacy. So anyone in this field has probably come across, there's about 5 common themes that I've come across throughout my research, and they are the privacy paradox, the trade-off paradigm, contextual framing, as I've just mentioned, public awareness and trust are the most common themes when I'm looking at attitudes towards privacy, particularly information privacy. So the privacy paradox is more about what people are willing to trade. So in other words, the literature suggests that people are concerned about privacy, but at the same time they're willing to trade it for convenience. And this is referred to as the privacy paradox. Now, the trade-off paradigm is the got nothing to hide argument. So it assumes that an increase in security comes at the expense of privacy, and this is referred to as the trade-off paradigm. And it manifests itself in the argument that people have nothing to hide. So therefore, only criminals have something to worry about, and so therefore we should just really accept, what's going on. Now, contextual framing is very important, I feel, in terms of any type of survey or any type of research, because people do value privacy, but they also do value security, as shown in the Prisons project. But from what context? So if it's from a safety context, and we've seen that with COVID, that people are afraid for their health, didn't have any problems with some of the measures that were introduced, at least in this country. So contact tracing, certainly people didn't have a problem with that. The Western Australian government purchased more ankle bracelets to ensure that people were in isolation if they should have been. People really conformed with civil liberty restrictions, such as going out only in twos and only going out for necessary items. So we can see that that context certainly gets people support. Crime or terrorism related, certainly people support that, and health related, as I've just mentioned. So other factors that we need to consider is that attitudes can and do change over time. So if we're doing a survey now on COVID and the response effort, perhaps in 10 years' time, people are going to have, a look back. The historians are probably going to write a fair bit about it and look at all the rights and wrongs that went on in this time. Demographics certainly plays an important role. So we're talking about age, race, political identity, I think at the moment is interesting. We're certainly living in interesting times at the moment in terms of how people are politically identifying. Not that that's something I want to focus on, but I think doing a survey in this environment or research in this environment is going to be very telling. And I've already mentioned about framing and trusts. However, awareness of the information environment is something that I feel is very important in terms of moving forward. So are we surveying a public about an information environment that is not adequately understood by its citizenry? So for example, when you frame things in a different context, so I have a pilot survey running at the moment as an example of that. And I put forward 2 hypothetical questions. One is that there's surveillance in a small town, and at the moment the crime rate is relatively low and people don't seem to be bothered by that. But a follow-up question to that is now the government wants to introduce facial recognition and upload that to a central database for identity matching, which is really something that could possibly happen. They change their attitude significantly. Now, I haven't put those results all together yet because I'm still gathering responses, but just from a quick look at that, people tend to change their attitudes based on the context and their awareness and information about a specific surveillance program. So I feel that this is a really important part. So the split between the necessity to operate within, but the lack of understanding and the structures of the information society is increasingly making the public feel powerless and confused. And that is something that I'm going to bring into my future research. So who else cares? Well, we certainly have some big players that do care, and we have to remember that Apple, for example, Cisco as well, big players like that tend to sell their products based on security encryption and things like that, that your information is safe, that it can't be hacked, etc. So other people do certainly care, and they certainly had something to say about the Assistance and Amendment Act of 2018 that has not yet passed, I don't think. So will COVID make a difference? I certainly think it will. So we've got to think about things such as public trust because it plays a critical role regarding surveillance in society. Now, the Australian government has a history of trust issues with the Australian public, such as its pursuit of journalists, and I've put a few examples down here, and Julian Assange is also one example that we could cite. They've just introduced into Parliament proposed amendments to the ASIO Act, which I've mentioned before, and they have been described as one more step towards a totalitarian state. So Brown and colleagues show in their research regarding transparency and whistleblowing that public attitudes towards whistleblowing is divided, with at least half of them feeling that information was kept too secret. So in other words, we have a trust and transparency issue pre-COVID. So obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, this has prompted governments to find technological solutions capable of contributing to the response effort. And now the government, with already trust issues, is asking Australia to trust it on providing adequate protections. Now, the CoGood Safe application hasn't achieved universal uptake by all federal politicians and some ministers. So one politician has given the protection of the identity of whistleblowers as a reason why he won't download the application. So we've certainly got some trust issues going on, at least in this country. As I've mentioned previously, we have a bilateral agreement between Australia and the United States following the enactment of the United States Cloud Act. Now, this may or may not weaken the protections under the Australian Privacy Act, and this agreement is actually subject to the outcome of review at the moment. It's currently being negotiated, and as of this morning at least, a report was due out on June 26th, but we haven't yet had the report released. So other issues worthy to note include function creep and exemptions to current Australian law. So current Australian law, that in the privacy sphere being the Australian Privacy Act, there are certainly many exemptions to that. And then we have the Cloud Act coming into the mix, where we've got internationals coming in requesting data, and Australia kind of providing data, and vice versa. And the exemptions to some of the laws here in Australia do include some state and federal government agencies, as well as state government as well, also exempt. So there are a lot of issues in this landscape, and it's becoming quite confusing. Now, in terms of function creep, the originally intended purpose doesn't necessarily mean that the surveillance technology will cease to operate. So as a case in point, the CoGood Safe application, while the Australian government has stated that the data store must be deleted when the pandemic ends, as noted by Ahmed and colleagues, the term end of pandemic is certainly very vague. So we're not really sure in terms of when the end of the pandemic is. So there appears to be moves by the government to support privacy concerns. So obviously public opinion is weighing in. Minister Stuart Roberts revealed at a National Press Club conference address that the government had begun examining the sovereignty requirements of government data sets. So as I mentioned previously, currently the COVID data store will be hosted on AWS, but if they are starting to ponder these new sovereignty rules, then perhaps that will change in the future. So looking at Turner's three process theory here, this is kind of where we were looking at it through this lens. So we find evidence of shared social identity or group formation. So if we look from left to right here, the group formation is driven by the COVID threat and expressed by the frequent kind of advertising or media campaigns as we are all in this together. So that's kind of where we're looking at this, is that we're all in this together, so this is our kind of social identity. And the influence there has three elements. So there's evidence of persuasion or convincing you that your view is the correct one. So here we're looking at the advertising campaigns for citizens to download the application, or the authority or belief that someone else can control what you do. So this would be the government wants you to download the application. So therefore there's your kind of authority there, and the coercion that someone can control your behaviour. So in other words, you mightn't be able to attend events if you don't download the application. Now that hasn't been legislated, of course. The downloading of the app is voluntary. However, there have been moves and comments and news reports about people not being able to go to the football, for example, if they don't have the app on their phone. So we're really looking at it through this end. And the final element of the model is gaining control of resources. And this is by means of the collected data from the application becoming a resource to the government. So that's pretty much it in terms of what this paper was all about, and most of it is, there's a lot more to it, obviously you'll have to read the paper, but this is pretty much the viewpoint.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Can we just wrap up very quickly? Sorry, I've let
yes, I won't actually go through the conclusion too much because I'm pretty sure you're pretty intelligent people can read it, but basically just summing up what I just said here in the conclusion, but the final comments being, you know, where do we draw the line between surveillance state and enabling security agencies, the ability to effectively do their job, and effectively being the key word there, because we all know that governments are a slow-moving entity, and they also need to do their job. Surveillance technology enables us to do that, but without succumbing to lucrative markets, the selling of information and over-policing society. So what do people think about all of this? And that's pretty much where this is going to move forward. So thank you very much for your patience, attendance and attention.